Hey there everybody, it's Mark Crowley. I'm back with another video. Today I am going to be offering 14 pieces of advice relating to humor. Now, a lot of people right from the beginning are going to be like, what, Crowley, you think you're funny? I got news for you, you are not funny. Well, no, I'm not presenting myself as an expert on comedy here. I'm just sharing a few things that I've picked up over the years since I started doing comics back in 1995, and, you know, take them for what they're worth. Different principles relating to humor writing specifically. Since I'd like people to have something to look at as I do these videos, I'm working on a drawing here of Buzz Lightyear. I think a fine example of comedy writing in Toy Story, all three of those movies. And I will be returning to Toy Story as an example as I get into some of these principles of humor. Now, the first one is super common. Everyone's heard it before. It is this one: brevity is the soul of wit. Basically that says it all. Keep the sentence short if you're trying to be funny. The longer you go on and on, the less funny it tends to become. But there's exceptions to all of this stuff. Sometimes wordiness can also be funny. So everything that I say here, you will find plenty of exceptions to these rules. Let's move on to the next one, number 2. Most humor is built on an element of surprise. The more predictable it is, the less funny it will be. I think this is generally true. If you can see where the joke is headed, by the time you get to the punchline, no one's really going to laugh that hard because they're like, yeah, I knew what you were going to do. I think basically there's this 1-2 punch of like a surprise twist in the joke, and first we're surprised, and then we're kind of delighted, and then we laugh. So yeah, basically the more surprising the end of your joke is, the bigger the laughs are going to be. I don't think I have to go too much further into that one. Number 3, many jokes rely on people agreeing with the fundamental truth that's being presented. And yeah, you know, even though comedy is, you think of it just being all about laughs, there does tend to be a sort of a point of view underneath it. If people agree with you and what you're saying, they're going to laugh harder. So yeah, that's why, you know, like political humor, if your guy, the person that you're a fan of, is being made fun of, you're not going to laugh as hard because you don't agree with the sort of truth underlying the joke. Now, how does that affect you as a writer of political jokes? I don't know. You probably just double down and make the joke with the audience that you have in mind. But, you know, just for things that aren't political, you have to maybe think about if you're commenting on human nature, is the thing that you're saying something that most people will find to be true? And you may want to think about that. Sometimes some jokes are built on something that most people say, well, no, I've never experienced. That doesn't ring true to me. And you're just not going to get the same laughs as you will with someone where people recognize, there's this like recognition of like, yeah, that's so true. And I think we're going to come back to that one later on. This is a sort of a nuts and bolts thing that a lot of people notice as they're writing comedy. If there is a funniest part of the sentence, arrange the words so that it becomes the last part of the sentence. Very often the final word. If there's a funny sort of reveal, you put it in at the end. And I definitely find myself, when I'm trying to make a funny sentence, very often rewriting it, sort of even at the risk of it becoming a little convoluted. I'm trying to delay that funniest word or that funniest bit until it comes to the end. I think basically it's just, you don't want a whole lot of words coming after that, because then it's anticlimactic in a way. Maybe the whole joke is a little bit like a movie. You're building towards this big climactic punchline, and you don't want to hang around too long after you've delivered that punchline. So, again, lots of exceptions to any of these rules, but that is certainly something that I have made use of over the years. Number 5, a very serious story usually needs a dose of humor. A funny story may benefit from a moment of seriousness. And I think we've all seen this. To go back to Pixar yet again, the movie Up is famous for a very moving scene at the beginning, that brings people to tears. But it is largely meant to be a comedy, I suppose, sort of an entertaining movie. And I think in a way you could argue that that opening montage that brings everyone to tears is made all the more powerful by the context of it being in this otherwise quite funny movie. But it's not necessary, I think, to have seriousness in the middle of comedy. I can think of plenty of funny movies, funny stories that are just, it's all about the laughs. It doesn't want to ever be serious, and that's not a problem. I think the opposite, though, does become a little bit of a problem. That is to say, a serious story that is serious from beginning to end, and there's never, ever a lighter moment of any kind. Most people can't take it after a while. You need they call it comic relief, right? It's a relief. You need to sort of break up the tension of all this sadness, all this heaviness. So it is sort of interesting to me that these are not mirror images of one another. Seems to me a serious story needs some amount of humor somewhere. A humor story does not necessarily need to have seriousness, but it can benefit from seriousness. One of my favorite comedies, at the risk of lingering too long on this point, is Planes, Trains, and Automobiles. And there are certain points in that story where it does become rather emotional for me, in terms of the character played by John Candy, Dale Griffiths, who is otherwise just a really funny character, but at certain points he becomes believable and serious, and it becomes quite powerful to me and makes that movie much more memorable than it would be without those scenes. Let's move on now to number 6. Most humorous stories have a consistent tone. If it starts over the top, it stays over the top. And again, all these rules, you can find exceptions to them, but I think it is a little weird to have a comedy where the style of humor is all over the place, and it can be jarring. I would say basically at the beginning, they set the tone. This is going to be a sort of a subtle comedy with everything presented quite straight and serious, rather than played for laughs. And then the whole rest of it goes from there. In fact, even as I say that, I'm beginning to regret that I did not include that. Let's think of this as number 15. As a principle of comedy, sometimes it is much more funny to play it straight than to go over the top and wink at the audience, and I've seen that a lot with comedic actors, and I always appreciate it when they're so 100% committed to it. You would never know that they are in a comedy. They're not playing it for laughs; they're playing it serious. And we'll call that principle number 15 there. Sometimes it's funnier to present it in a serious way, even though it's meant to provoke laughter. But let us get back to the order of things. You know what? I'm going to pull out my trusty black Prismacolor here and begin to darken in some of the line work here with Buzz Lightyear. Definitely we'll be kicking this into time-lapse later on to finish off the drawing. But let's move on now to number 7. If you're going for all-out comedy, pay attention to the frequency of the jokes. And that is to say, once you decide that your entire goal is comedy, I think you really have to commit to that and keep delivering again and again and again. And it's challenging to keep this rapid-fire sequence of jokes going. I basically have never tried to do an all-out comedy. I've done, probably the closest I've come to a straight-up comedy story was my first comic book series, Akiko, which was largely comical, largely jokey, and then occasionally exciting and other stuff mixed in. I have never tried to do like a straight-up comedy. Is that the Zucker brothers who did Airplane? Some of these other things. They really do rely on just an endless string of jokes from beginning to end. And that's hard work, I think, as a comedy writer, to keep packing in the jokes. Anyway, if you've decided to do that kind of a thing, be prepared to deliver a certain number of jokes per page, almost, or else people will feel that it's slowing down, it's not funny enough. And maybe that's why I don't attempt to do such writing. I sort of blend these different things together. There's a little bit of comedy, there's a little bit of seriousness, there's a little bit of action and so forth, and then I don't feel that pressure of having to be constantly funny all the time. Anyway, there is, like I said in the earlier thing, you sort of, oh my goodness, hang on, the lighting situation changed. All right, well, a little unintentional comedy as my lighting apparatus fell apart midway through the video. My apologies. Let us get back now to number 8. Most really funny moments are the result of a very careful setup, and this is where we can get to Toy Story and that classic moment in Toy Story 1 when Woody finally loses his cool and he's like, "You are a toy," and everyone remembers that moment. And it's hilarious, and the reason it's funny is because they very carefully have set this up, and we've gone through all this stuff where Buzz Lightyear doesn't understand that he's a toy. He keeps saying things as if he was the real Buzz Lightyear, and we have seen Woody's frustration building, right? And so we finally get to that moment of release. And he explodes, and if that had happened earlier on, it would not have been nearly as funny. It's all about the setup and the patience of building up these two characters and the tension between them. More on that later, because that becomes another one. But the careful setup of building it all up so that we have this sense of release. Now, I also think that this is a good example of the underlying truth. And how comedy results from people agreeing or recognizing the truth of it. And I think in that scene, even though we're dealing with this outlandish situation, none of us have ever been toys. I know I haven't. But you're asked to make this leap of imagination about what it would be like if you were a toy. And encountering this other toy, it requires a lot of hypothetical leaps of the imagination, but I feel like there's a truth there of like someone dealing with someone who just doesn't get it, and it's driving you crazy, and you just wish you could say, look, to the guy at the office or whatever, she doesn't like you, okay? Just get over her, or whatever. Sometimes you just are so frustrated with the person who doesn't get it. And I think that kind of, everyone can identify with that, and that's part of why we laugh so hard when Woody just loses it in that moment. Anyway, classic moment of comedy, and it doesn't happen by accident. They very carefully built, constructed everything leading toward that moment. Let's move on now to number 9. Two characters who get along really well are rarely funny. And again, this is going to go right back to Woody and Buzz. There is humor in two characters that don't get along. It goes all the way back, I'm sure, to ancient times almost. This idea of the odd couple pairing. And you see it in buddy cop movies. You just see it everywhere. Because it's just not funny when people get along. It's not interesting. It's not dramatic. So we're constantly, as writers, putting together characters that are more like oil and water, and bickering. Which you got to be careful because that can become annoying, right? We get sick of people who are constantly arguing with one another. But there needs to be some core of like different world views almost. I shouldn't say needs to be, because again, there's exceptions to all of this, but it certainly is a tried and true method of comedy, and it goes back to Laurel and Hardy, all of these people. It's the humor of two people who do not get along, perfectly well. And in fact, I decided early on not to use too many of my own examples in this story, but I will take a moment to show you an example of two characters not getting along in one of my books. And the book that I'm thinking of is The Drawing Lesson, the book that came out last year. It's about a young boy who sort of pushes this artist woman into becoming his teacher, and he's constantly sort of roping her into giving him lessons, largely against her will. And finally, even this moment here could be thought of as a sort of "you are a toy" moment, where he's about to say, "Can I come over here?" And she's like, "No, you cannot come back here tomorrow." She just explodes in rage, kind of like Woody does with Buzz. Similar situation. Well, this is what I'm talking about here. If she had been a willing teacher who delighted in giving him lessons, it's not funny. And without thinking about it too much, I just realized early on that this whole book was going to be more fun to read if there was some tension between the boy's desire to get lessons and this woman's lack of desire to be the teacher. And so, yeah, I think probably as good an example from my own work as you're going to find of the two characters who don't get along perfectly and how we derive humor from that. Let's move on to number 10. Beware of humor that kicks a man when he's down. This is certainly maybe getting into the realm of personal preference, but I find it hard to laugh at what I would call an unworthy target. If we are mocking someone who has already been mistreated by life or who is in an unfortunate situation, I find it hard to laugh. A joke that is making fun of homeless people, or a joke that is at the expense of a group of people who have been just wronged by history and the world in general. If you are indeed in a position of power, laughing at someone who lacks power, I find that I find it hard not to feel bad about that as the person who's doing the laughing. And so, yeah, if you're writing the jokes, be aware of who is being made fun of, who is being sort of mercilessly mocked. And generally, I would say it's the worthy targets, the people who deserve to be mocked. I'll get down off my soapbox. I think you get into the dangerous situation of people saying, "Oh, you're just being politically correct," or whatever. But at the very least, pay attention to who is the target of your joke, if indeed there is a target, someone that's being brought low. Think about whether life has already brought them low and you're just bringing them lower by way of your joke. Let's move on now to number 11. I feel it's better to succeed at being a little funny than to have people see you trying desperately to be hilarious. That's just, again, a personal preference, and I try to put these kind of things toward the end of the video, things that come down to my style of humor. I'm rarely trying to be hilarious. Most of the jokes in my books and stories are sort of moderately amusing, that kind of thing. And I do think that when people see you, and as a consumer of entertainment, when I watch a movie and I have the feeling, oh my goodness, they sure thought that this was going to be funny, or, the sort of, I would call it the Jar Jar Binks effect, where they clearly thought this, people are just going to love this, and it's embarrassing when it doesn't work. So better to not be seen to be trying so hard. I would much prefer to be just going for something that's a little more subtle. Smaller laughs than going for the big. If you're going to swing for the fences, you better pull it off, I guess, is the final thing that I'll say about that. And yes, some people, they know this is funny, and they are right. And they knock it out of the park. And, if you are capable of doing that, go for it. Let's move on now to number 12. Resist the temptation to take a good joke and beat it into the ground. This is probably my biggest pet peeve, and I see even the professionals. I see them doing this. They get a good joke, and they keep going back to the well, and they use it again and again. And it's just every time you use it, you dilute the power of that joke. In comedy, you know, with stand-up comics, they have what's called the callback, right? Where you refer back to some earlier thing. And it is, you know, it's a principle of comedy that works. It can work very well when you go back to that thing, this sort of shared thing that we had all experienced earlier in the routine. You go back in a surprising way or an unexpected way, can trigger laughter, but there's a fine line between that, the callback, and just beating a joke into the ground, milking it for all it's worth, going back to the well one too many times. You know, if you've got a good joke, let it stay a good joke. Don't ruin it by going. Even I've just seen it happen. Just the third time. God, why did you go back a third time? You know, it was funny the second time. It definitely wasn't when you went back the third time. We're coming toward the end of things here. This is number 13. Be careful about in-jokes. If all the humor requires previous knowledge of the series, new readers may feel locked out. And, you know, with the word series here, I am sort of talking about, like comic books, different things. It's tempting to make jokes that are only comprehensible to the devout fans who know all of this stuff. And I'm not saying never make jokes like that, but be careful if all of your jokes are in-jokes, then you don't give the new person encountering your story a place where they can climb on board. So I would say maybe best to have a mix of the different jokes. The in-joke that's there for the people who are in the know, and then the sort of more general jokes that are built on the scene at hand and require only your knowledge of what you are reading from the beginning of the current scene. You can't fail with a joke like that. Everyone has the ammunition or the sort of raw materials needed to understand the joke. We are getting close down to the end of it. I think what I'll do is I'll save the last piece of advice here until after I do my time lapse and finish up my drawing of Buzz Lightyear. So give me just a moment and I will be right back. All right, well, I think we're far enough along here with this drawing that I can move on to the final pieces of advice. Number 14, stick with what's genuinely funny to you, not something that you imagine is funny to others. You know, humor is so subjective. It really, you're never going to make something that's funny to everyone. That's basically impossible. And you make it even harder on yourself if you try to imagine what other people think is funny. You could really have to stick with your own preferences and then hope that there are other people out there that share your sense of humor. And number 15 would have been, as I said before, you know, consider the straight-faced delivery. Sometimes it's funnier when you don't show that you're in on the joke, and this extends to the realm of cartooning. If you are drawing cartoon characters' faces, sometimes it's funnier if you draw them with a very serious look on their face, even as they say something like, you know, Meredith, there is nothing that matters more to me than hashed brown potatoes. You know, and if you draw the character with this very sincere, understated look on their face, it may be funnier than if you had played it up with something ultra cartoony. Well, I think that brings us to the end of this video. Let me go ahead and grab my books so that I can thank everyone who has supported me by getting them, like Brody's Ghost, my graphic novel series. Not a whole lot of jokes in here, but every once in a while I slipped in some comedy. We got Mastering Manga 3 and my very latest book, Manga Art. I really cannot say thank you enough to those of you who have supported me by getting any of these books. But let me go ahead and lay down this pencil. I want to thank you all for watching this video. I really hope you enjoyed it, and I'll be back with another one real soon.